I'm delighted to be able to come here. It's a real privilege to be able to speak to you tonight. I've known Tim for many years, and Tim has been our family GP, and he's been a GP, the sort of GP you had always wanted. And I will always remember times when, for example, my daughter, when she was a very young child having eczema, and I'd ring Tim up on a Sunday night and say, what do we do? Next thing I know, Tim's up there, up at our house, sorting and treating her, and that sort of dedication. So it's a real privilege, Tim, to be able to come here and speak to you on which I think is your last night as president. So thank you. That's a good start, isn't it? There we go. As Tim pointed out, I'm not a doctor. I'm a medical support officer, which is effectively a medical operational planner. My job is to deliver the healthcare system and run the healthcare system, and those that you work in health, either secondary care or primary healthcare, you'll be familiar with administrators, and some of you may be administrators, and some of you may have great respect for them, and some of you may not. But I am a medical operational planner, so that's my role there. My background, I joined the Army as a regular officer in 1993. I went straight into the medical corps, and so my background has been things such as Bosnia, Kosovo, Iraq, Afghanistan, Northern Ireland, those sort of operational tours where, it is a kinetic threat. People don't necessarily want you there, and you are put at risk by being there, but you are there because you have a role to do. Sierra Leone was different. Sierra Leone was very much, for a lot of us with families, a very much more personal experience. We were actually engaging with the population a lot more than sometimes we do, and it was also a humanitarian. And the government is normally quite reluctant to commit military forces to humanitarian. And often humanitarian agencies don't necessarily want military forces there because it's not necessarily within their parameters, and it sometimes makes life harder for them. But Sierra Leone, I think, was slightly different. What you see on the slide there is my two children at that age, India and Jacob, and that's the age they were 10 years ago in 2014. So they were young. And the reason why I put that up there is because it just really, for us, a lot of us with families, we connected with the deployment, and it made it easier, it made it more worthwhile, but also made it harder in certain circumstances. So during that time, I was the Chief of Staff for 2nd Medical Brigade. And for those of you who are aware, Queen Elizabeth Barracks in Strensall, 2nd Medical Brigade is just in there. And its roles changed slightly, but effectively, its role is to govern the deployed hospital care that the British Army needs in the land environment. So at that time, we had 3 field hospitals with different roles plus supporting units. And we would go out, we support places like Afghanistan. So if a soldier was injured, they get treated by medics at the pre-hospital emergency care. They'd then come back and they'd end up in the hospital and they get trauma care. So that's the role. And the Chief of Staff is effectively, for those that, it's a similar role to you have a Chief of Staff in other organisations, but the Chief of Staff is the lead planner. He coordinates, he turns the commander's intent, the good ideas, and makes that good idea theory into reality with the staff and manages that relationship. So you have to be across a lot of things. And it was a job I'd always wanted to do, and it was a great job. So in terms of chronology, so in 2014, and if I just give you a view, we started doing initial scoping of Ebola. Ebola was an outbreak that had started, it was gathering momentum. It came up in different places. It wasn't in the Congo where it's normally. It was in Sierra Leone, and it was in centres of population, not just in Sierra Leone, in Liberia and Guinea. And so there was started to be a bit of scoping and a bit of nervousness about what we should do, because obviously Sierra Leone being an ex-Commonwealth country, and so myself and the brigade commander, we were tasked to go out in August 14 and do a recce to assess the feasibility of setting up an Ebola treatment centre. The reason for that is Sierra Leone's healthcare system had collapsed. A lot of the healthcare workers, and there are, it wasn't a particularly strong healthcare system in the first place, it's quite under-resourced. A lot of the healthcare workers had contracted it before they even realised what Ebola was. They contracted it, and a large number of them died. So they were in real difficulties. And some of the NGOs, because there was no way to treat, and a lot of the NGOs were pulling back because they couldn't put their people at that level of risk. So we were tasked to go out there, have a look and say, is it possible to set up an Ebola treatment centre that would provide care for the foreign volunteers or the foreign healthcare workers if they got sick, so that foreign healthcare workers from the NGOs would come back into the country and provide the role that they did. So myself and the brigade commander, we went out and we did a recce. And I remember things about that recce. It was unusual because we were told to go in civilian clothes because they didn't want us to be particularly overt. And I remember being told, go and buy some civilian clothes. So I said, well, how much do I spend? Because the army is very focused on budgets and the rest of it. And they said, doesn't matter, just go. The idea is you go there, you'll probably have to burn them when you come back. So just go and get some civilian clothes. So I went down to go outdoors and bought some civilian clothes. And like a good soldier, I didn't burn them when I got back. I gave them a good wash and then I've been using those since. And I suspect everybody else did. But we went out there and we had a chance to speak to the non-government agencies, the World Health Organization, Médecins Sans Frontières, the ones that were still operating there. And we tried to ask them, what's the problem? Where can we help? And we picked up things such as one of the key points of transfer for healthcare workers is when they've completed a shift, they're very tired, they're dehydrated, and their concentration lapses when they take off their protective clothing and they're getting infected at that point. So we took that aboard. We came back. My brigade commander, we wrote a report. My brigade commander gave his back brief to a general called the Chief of Joint Operations. So in the Army, he's the man that works at Permanent Joint Headquarters in Northwood. And the MOD say, we want to run this operation. Permanent Joint Headquarters in Northwood, they run the operations. So he's in charge of saying what the operation is. And the question for us was not could we do it, is should we do it? Or that was the question for the government. So we did that. We did our report. We put it into the system. We had some briefings and we sort of stepped away. Often you do recce's, and it doesn't transpire into any military deployment. There's not a requirement for it. This time it was slightly different. There was a gathering political will to deploy military forces. The US had deployed 5,500 Marines to Liberia. The French were deploying into Guinea. And our government said, we need to stand alongside and we need to do that to show the world that we are supportive, etc. So there was an expansion of the role. So I was called down to this Permanent Joint Headquarters it was a Friday, and it was basically to do an estimate, to go through the analysis of our report, amongst other things, and say, what could we do? And we're expecting to do that. When we got down there, things had moved on. An estimate normally says, this is what we're going to do, this is what we can't do, and this is how we're going to take it forward. The next stage is you get told what to do. So actually, we got a thing called a receipt of orders brief, where you're actually told what to do. And we basically walked into a room. There was a lot of other logisticians from a headquarters I'd worked with before, and they said, there is a plane going on Sunday morning. There are 40 seats on the plane. You're the brigade commander, not me. Point to the brigade commander. You decide who you want on that plane, and you take your team with you. And tell us what you want us to tell you to do. So we crafted our orders, gave it to them. They turned around and we said, okay, we'll do what we've asked you to tell us to do. The commander decided he would take some risk, but not a lot of risk. So he took 27 of us on the grounds that there was no healthcare system for us. There was an Italian NGO that was still operating, but they wouldn't guarantee that we would be treated over and above anybody else. They would treat us in accordance with property. So literally there was no healthcare system. And he didn't want to take that level of risk. So we took 27. So there was me and the commander as the medical and some others. And we went, and until there was more people coming out to the ground to provide the medical support, he would only carry that level of risk. And we went on the Sunday. We were told you're either going for 2 weeks or 6 months, but we should have you back within 6 months. And I remember leaving Wombleton, where we live, and saying goodbye to Sarah and the kids. And the driver came to collect me, and we were driving down the road, and it was a tractor rally. And it took us probably more time to get out of Wombleton than, because all the tractors going, it was a little bit surreal. And Sarah was like, oh, well, I don't know when you're going to be back, but I'll manage with the kid. And I think I came back about 5.5 months or so later, just after Christmas. So we went out there. In September, we started building a Ebola treatment center. Then we did some Ebola training academy, and I'll go through what that is there. The facilities were open and the treatment center was open. All of this was going on over that period of time against a rising case of Ebolas in Sierra Leone and across that whole West Africa, but we were very much focused on Sierra Leone. That slide there, if you can't see it, that's a picture by David Rowlands, and it is effectively what became synonymous of what we did. So up in the top left, you have the combined joint interagency task force. Combined is when you have both military and other partners in it. So we were working with DFID, Department of International Development. Joint is because you had Army, Navy, Air Force. Integrated is because we were working together and task force is because it was a task force. But you can see in there in the top in the middle, you had RFA Argus, which had a role-free facility on there. In the right, you can see treatment and training. You can see treatment provided and logistics provided in the bottom right. You can see engineers building stuff in the bottom left, and you can see safe burials sort of middle left, etc. And that really summarised some of the work that we were to do. And I'll go through some of that in a little bit more detail. So our medical branch, which sat within that, it was composite group, and there was only myself and the commander and one other, the medical plans, who was a major, had worked together before. We came from the bread. Everybody else that covered those factors covered logistics, covered healthcare governance, training, operations, intelligence, force protection. They were all individual augmentees. They've been brought together for the task. So, and we'd had no pre-deployment training. They came out a bit later, and we'd had no pre-deployment training. So it was very much, what do you know, how do you do it, and how do you work together? So it's a real opportunity to, form a team under fire, or form a team under pressure. But you had all the spectrum of healthcare within that. Partway through, we started setting up smaller facilities, headquarters in what was the district Ebola response centres. So some of those individuals were spread out to provide that. We had to provide the full baseline of support. The key thing we had to do was support the deployed force. There was no point us being there if we're going to get sick and can't look after ourselves and become a burden on someone else. So we had to have our own medical support. We had to prepare. We had to establish an Ebola treatment facility, which is the MED1 led, which is in Carytown. We had to support DFID. DFID were already out there with their water and sanitation program, and they were building 5 large Ebola treatment centres. And the infrastructure was going on. They were great at building them. They hadn't worked out they needed to staff them, and so we had to work with that. And so we set up a training academy and stakeholder engagement. The thing about Sierra Leone is the structures are quite small, so you can have engagement with Chief of Defence Staff in Sierra Leone. You can have engagement with the Royal Sierra Leone Armed Forces, with the minister. I used to go to meetings where the Secretary of State for Defence, because the President declared it as a national emergency, and given power to Secretary for Defence as opposed to the Ministry of Health. And so we would sit at these meetings where, these cabinet officers would have, and we'd also be having meetings on Zoom back to UK Cabinet Office and COBRA meetings, etc. And it was always interesting to see how the government actually works, both sides. We also had to protect our personnel and sustain them, and there were a number of non-medical effects, such as safe burials and contact tracing, that we had to cover as well. Not necessarily in the medical side, but we were across that organisation. So the operational environment. Those are some photos of it. You'll see up on the top left, obviously there's a map of where Sierra Leone is, but you'll see in the top left, there is some tarmac metal roads. Some of the infrastructure was very good, very hilly. It was raining. It was sort of the monsoon season, but there were some very good roads. And that's assigned to Carytown, where the treatment, that's just outside Freetown. When you go off the roads, it became very muddy and very poor roads very quickly. But there's quite a lot of investment. There's a lot of Chinese investment there because of minerals. There was a Chinese hospital there, although we didn't have much opportunity to engage with it. The local environment, so you'll see the mud tracks, particularly wet, but the local environment, it was poor. It was overcrowded, particularly in Freetown. There was disease, but there wasn't a massive amount of malnutrition that we could see. So it was, people were there, but there were, quite a lot of slum areas and that sort of thing. There was also a lot of the echoes of the Sierra Leone Civil War with the West Side Boys, etc. And you see a lot of young men riding around on little mopeds as moped taxis, and they were theoretically all part of the West Side Boys. And so Sierra Leone was still recovering from its own civil war from there. But as a country, it wasn't on its knees as a country, but it was facing a major health emergency. And you'll see, limited food and limited clothing, but generally people are happy. That on the right, that is the track to the main logistics hub. So that's the road into the main logistics hub, and I'll show you a picture of that inside later on. So not necessarily the most upmarket of places, but it was functional. One of the things that surprised me was the Sierra Leone Sierra Leoneans welcomed us. They welcomed us in the term of their colonial masters and returned to us in our hour of need. And that is exactly their words. They felt that almost, that we had a parental responsibility as the British to support them at the time they needed. They'd gained their independence peacefully, but they wanted to support us. So they welcomed us back. And a lot of the public were pleased to see us. So that was welcoming. So that meant the threat was not necessarily a kinetic terrorist or violent threat, but we still had the threat of roads, we had the threat of malaria, we still had the threat of, obviously, Ebola. So we had to have a medical plan and the response time. So we have a thing called range ring. So you have an area where you have to get somebody to surgery within an hour. That's generally the way, and this we were indoctrinated by that from Afghanistan. And from Afghanistan, we basically felt that we are reliant on air support helicopters. So Chinooks, MERT teams, medical emergency response teams. So condition from Iraq and Afghanistan, British Army expects if somebody's injured, a helicopter flies in, picks them up and brings them back. The problem you have in Sierra Leone is places to land helicopters in the jungle aren't very good. The weather is very bad. It can be, you can have thunderstorms all of a sudden. And so helicopters can't fly. And also trying to actually refuel and move helicopters around is not the easiest task. So we had to have a flexible approach. We had to look at road as well. And what we found is that whilst you would expect a helicopter to get you there quicker, sometimes in certain circumstances, particularly around Freetown where it was really congested, if somebody was injured, it was quicker to move them by a blue light matrix ambulance rather than wait for a helicopter. And so we had both. We also had a primary healthcare risk. We were responsible for civilian personnel, both from the embassy, from the non-government organisations that were entitled under the medical rules of eligibility, Department of International Development, other government departments that were working there. When you join the army, they normally check you're fit, check you've got a pulse, check you're okay, and then keep an eye on you as you go through your service. So they pretty much know whether we are, still upright or not. Whereas with the civilian population, which a lot of them were significantly older, there was a whole uncertain amount of injuries and illnesses and different approaches to things like malaria prevention, etc. So it gave a different dimension to it. So we had to have deployed hospital care, and you'll see on the left what's called a field surgical team. So it's effectively a very small surgical team. And so before the commander would accept any more risk to any more people, we established a small field hospital in the headquarters where we work, and we just basically took over some classrooms and set it up in there. And that was one critical care, one ED bay, one surgical table, one ITU bed, and a couple of intermediate care beds. And that's all it was. That was enough. What we worked on is that the most likely accident is a road accident, and people travel in pairs. So the worst case scenario is you've got two people injured in an accident. One is on the table, one is in critical care, one is in ED, or they move through, and then you work from that. And we were supported by a Royal Fleet Auxiliary ship, and you see that on the right. That was there for a logistics purpose, but also it can carry a field hospital. So we had the Royal Navy put a field hospital on that, so we had that. The challenge is, as I said, the thunderstorms, etc., trying to get people from land to that ship when the ship is rocking around in the sea and there's thunderstorms was an issue. So we had to keep that land-based capability. You also, the ship had to go out to sea they did this Navy thing called make water. I don't know what it is, whether it's drinks or whether it's actually a practical thing, but it went out and it would disappear and then it would come back. So we had to do that. And they were also very, very wary of Ebola on the ship, catching that. The one thing the ship did bring was dental care. And that was actually really, really useful. There would have been about 20 people that would have had to have gone back to the UK for dental care if there hadn't been a dentist on board that ship. So fundamental thing, but it was really helpful. So I was responsible for the land-based medical care. So it was my responsibility was to make sure we had that set up along with the other tasks. Whilst I was doing that, the field hospital that was going to deploy and become the Ebola treatment unit, 2-2 Field Hospital, based in Aldershot, but came up to York, they were re-rolling. So as I said, those top slides really show you what we were used to in Afghanistan. The bottom right slide shows you a field hospital set up along a central spine, normally on an airfield or a runway or something like that. Not when planes are working, but we normally find a runway where they don't want to land planes on. And then in the left, you see a surgical team operating. It's all about trauma. It's about getting individual or numbers of patients from point of injury on a helicopter back in front of the surgeons, where you get all the consultants around them like a Formula One team. They treat them, and then you give them the best chance of survival. That wasn't Ebola. Ebola was about treatment. It was about, as Tim said, it's about palliative care. It's about supportive care, etc. So simple in some ways, but not what we were geared up to. So that field hospital had to re-roll into something that it wasn't used to doing. So we had a training phase, and that is toe-foot blinds. So anybody that is familiar with the Strengthsville area, the cut through from Strengthsville to the A64, go along there, there's a little sort of collection of buildings on the left. That's toe-foot blinds. It's connected to 2 Med Brigade. Used to be a mechanical base. Now it's a thing called the Army Medical Services Training Centre. So it has in there, they do macro simulation. So what you had was, we were out in Sierra Leone, the field hospitals back in the UK, they were getting ready. They did directed training. So they would have people being given lessons by things like the health protection, infectious diseases, Public Health England, etc. So they went through those, and all the individuals had almost a tag on their arm, and so every time they went into a lesson, they were zapped to make sure they would stay there, and every time they left the lesson, they were zapped. That way, we had a record of who had done which training. You need that. If somebody gets Ebola, you want to know, were they actually trained on some of this stuff? So we had that. So that was that. You then had individual training, protection deals, donning and doffing, and individual clinical staff tasks. Donning and doffing, as I told you, as I mentioned, was a key risk. So what we did is we took the drills and we treated it as if it was a junior soldier on a rifle range for the first time. We broke down the drills and said to the soldier, said to the clinician, right, you've just finished. You are to put your left hand in the air. You are to take your left hand glove off with your right hand and do this, and you gave it drill by drill, and they worked on those, and it was done exactly. And that way you took the responsibility from that clinician who is probably thinking on what's happened, very tired, dehydrated, etc. So you took that responsibility off them and you controlled them as you went through that. And that all went through, and similar for doing that. And then you had collective training. So they brought them together as teams and worked on those teams and worked together as teams to do skills and drills. And what we built is a field hospital in the building, structure in the building that replicated what they would use in Sierra Leone. So whilst we were out in Sierra Leone building it, the engineers sent back a set of diagrams and said, this is what your field hospital will look like. They then set it all up and said, so you walk through and it was exactly the same. That is the drills. So that is effectively, we put these on, and those are the donning procedures, there were the glove change, and there were doffing procedures. And there was also a procedure for if somebody's collapsed. So they were absolute exact drills. You did not deviate from those if you at all. And we checked everybody. And what you could then do is we use things like UV agents. So we would deliberately we would deliberately cover people with a UV agent. They would then doff their equipment, and then you would scan them again, and you would prove to them that the don and doffing drills worked. And that also showed us other things. We started seeing little splatters. And what that came down to, and what we worked that out is the boots, underside of the boots, were ripped. And what was happening is the brush, effectively like a loo brush that we're cleaning off, that was flicking little bits of agent everywhere, and you were seeing those around the room. So we got rid of all those boots, and we got boots, Wellington boots, with flat soles, and that solved the problem. But it was literally simple things such as that is what allowed us to sort those problems out. In Sierra Leone, the treatment facility was being built, and that up there is a greenfield jungle site that was being cleared. And the purpose, as I said, was to reassure international healthcare workers, provide a high standard treatment, and support the local healthcare workers as far as possible. At the same time, there was another site being built on co-located with that and shared logistics, which was the Kerry Town. It was run by Save the Children, and that was a 10-bed and an 80-bed facility. So we had a small discrete facility. They had a very big facility, more for the general population. And Save the Children were the only UK charity that was prepared to step into that void. And in 6 weeks, they turned it from that into that with all the drainage and all the rest of it. our personnel, when we went first out on the recce, they were starting to clear the site. Myself and the brigade commander looked at it and felt that actually, if we house our people in a jungle camp next to that, they're never going to get any separation from what they're dealing with. So we drove about 10 minutes up the road, found effectively a holiday complex, which was not being used because there was nobody going to Sierra Leone on holiday because of Ebola. And so we did a deal and we used that and we put our people into there. So they had better accommodation and they had a degree of separation. And what you see is, people there doing temperature testing before anybody came anywhere near. You see people providing the palliative care. You see the donning and doffing, and you see how the ambulances were cleaned out afterwards. And that was key. So it was all practiced, all delivered. At the same time, we need to support the Royal Sierra Leone Armed Forces and their joint medical company, and that's their commanding officer there. They operated a 240-bed facility. They were a key capability. They were a key stakeholder in this. It was them. They were their government's response. And it was all very well that DFID coming in as an external organisation, external nation, saying, we're going to do this for you. Sierra Leone had to do some of the work for themselves, had to cover some of it themselves. So they were key. And they were based in a place called Wilberforce Barracks, which is just near where they were. And we'd worked with them in the past. Their numbers, they are free for-field hospital. Their numbers in Africa mirror the same numbers that we give our hospitals in the UK because of that. So they operated they operated 3 facilities, but 2 originally. One was we rebuilt a facility near the back of a hospital. We just basically took some accommodation and worked with the engineers to actually build that and turn that into a 40-bed facility. What you see there is the Police Training Academy in the Hastings. And whilst DFID were paying to build new sites, we took this, went and saw that, and we had a recce of it. I had a recce of it, spoke to the police commissioner and said, we want those buildings. And he said, I've been told by this defence secretary to give you what you need, you can have them. And when I went through the buildings, it was quite interesting. There were several of the buildings were full of motorbikes, little motorbikes, all exactly the same. And if you recall, I said that you had a lot of young men that used to give motorcycle taxis. So the way it worked was a motorcyclist would get pulled over by the police would confiscate their motorbike would be taken there, and then they get auctioned at the end of the month, and they buy back their own motorbike. And I asked them, what happens? Oh, well, what happens to the money? Oh, that's the police pension fund. So, but we can clear it for you, and we can have an auction, and we can sell it, and we cleared the space. So we had that, and that worked a lot quicker. One of the things that they weren't particularly used to doing initially was simulation. So you spoke about how we run simulation, how we use macro simulation. They didn't see the point of it. And then we spoke, and we encouraged them, and we went through it with them. And by the time we'd finished, they were very keen on simulation. And they saw the value. And that's their commanding officer giving them the pep talk at the end of that. But we repurposed those facilities. One of the things you'll see is that in that bottom left slide was we trained, and I'll talk about how we trained people and gave them awareness how to be safe to operate. But one of the problems we had is corruption. So we would train people, but because their name wasn't on the list held by the Ministry or Deputy Ministry for Health, they weren't getting employed. And so they would come here waving their certificates saying, we want jobs, we want work. And we were at the front there trying to manage that without it turning into a riot for that. Because if you're not paying the money to be on the right list, you're not getting the job. And it was always a challenge to actually manage those situations without it getting out of control. But these are the treatment facilities. They're very basic, they're very austere, but they were very direct, in their training. I do remember I've got it on a video somewhere, and I didn't think it was appropriate to show the clip, but one of the senior instructors saying to somebody who'd done something wrong, if you do that again, if you get that wrong, shouting at him, I will kill you, and then I will eat you. And so I thought, that's probably not the training technique that we want in the British Army, but it's what they were used to, and it's what worked for them. But yeah, I will eat you and I will kill you. If you recall, whilst that was going on, so you had us setting up our own treatment facility, you had the Sierra Leone's running their own facilities, and you had Department for International Development working with partners to build 5 centres across Sierra Leone, and they were very good at building the centres. What they hadn't worked out, as I said, is that you need the staff to do this. You need people that can take water to the patient, that can wash the patient, that can, take a dead patient out, etc. And so we were tasked to look at how we can work that out. And I worked with that. And I went and saw World Health Organization, who were operating at Sierra Leone's National Football Stadium. And they were training they had 4 courses going on any one time. It was about 120 people a week. We needed 4,000 people within 8 weeks, which was a significant task. So we went to the World Health Organization and we went to DIF and said, can you get the people? If you can get the people, we will train them. You bring them there. So we worked with partners. So we took our consultants that were manning that small facility, that 111, the critical care bed, the ITU bed, the surgical table, the one that based on Freetown. For us, one thing I've learned in my army career is that a consultant, if not kept busy, gets into mischief. So it's best to keep them busy. So we put them through that course and said, we need you to form a faculty, take that faculty and train and start training more people. So it was basically a training pyramid scheme. So we put people through that. We then asked, and I remember the Chief of Joint Operations coming out, he came to that headquarters and he said, what do you need to actually make this happen? I said, we need a medical regiment. And when do you need it? I said, we need it by this day. And I was, putting my head on the line a bit, and the brigade commander was looking at me and thinking, I hope he knows what he's talking about. And he said, right, you'll have it. And it was actually the unit that they sent out was the unit I used to be a CO of. So that was really good. And I knew them. They came out with a couple of days to spare, and they got in. And we worked with Sierra Leone Army because they weren't doing anything. They weren't training. We worked with the nurses, student nurses in the university, because the universities are all shut down, and other NGOs. So we put together a team that was trained by our consultants, and they escalated that. We took over various different locations and started training people, and we had flexibility in there. And the idea being, as soon as we could, we would extract our people from it, and they would then train their own people. But there were some practical considerations you have to consider. So, for example, electricity was vulnerable. And if you're going to start using PowerPoint and projectors, and we get we're using PowerPoint at the moment, you couldn't rely on it. So we went to a guy that does sign writing and said, we need you to make, about a dozen flip charts. And I think we spent about £100,000. We probably overpaid. Spent about £100,000 on flip charts, on sets. And these things that they're on a big board, and you went through all the drills with them. Don't tell anybody else we spent £100,000, because I don't think the cabinet office are actually aware, but we did spend quite a bit of money on that. But that gave us the flexibility to do that training. We also had to protect our people, and we had to have resilience. We had to make sure force protection. In Sierra Leone, at the time, Ebola wasn't the biggest threat to our health. Malaria was the biggest threat. You will not catch Ebola unless you physically have contact with individuals. And I'm not a doctor, but I know you can catch malaria without having any contact with individuals. And it was things such as people having their sleeves up. It was people not using sun cream. And so we were very keen to make sure everybody wore sleeves down, even though it was uncomfortable. And I remember the brigade commander saying to people, if you think having your sleeves down is uncomfortable, malaria is even worse. So people, and we were very rigid, but we had to encourage our civilian partners that was working with us to follow the same. We had to encourage them not to sunbathe, and basically follow the same rules. Force health protection was another aspect of that was things like swing fogging. So in the morning, you would have a chap would go out around the different bases with a swing fog. It would spray effectively an insecticide, and that would kill the larvae there. And I remember the guy that we had up at Freetown, he'd been doing it for years. It was a regular thing, to the point where when they gave him a new respirator to protect him, he'd been so used to inhaling, because the old respirator wasn't working, his protective device was so ineffectual. He'd been so used to it, and he was so dependent on it. As soon as we gave him a new one, he collapsed because it was the heat. So probably should have left him alone, but that went on. And we had swing fogs dotted around the place, and they were a critical piece of equipment. When one broke, you actually physically would fix one, and somebody would drive out to it to get a new one to them, and we keep spares in there. Logistics was another challenge. So if you can imagine all the equipment, all the medical drugs coming into Sierra Leone, being flown in, at volume by British government. Planes would arrive, trucks would pick them up. That's that picture of that road, and that was the depot in there. That was their warehouse, and it was shared with our NGOs. There was no security. we went through and we started sorting out and trying to audit for them, trying to work out where they got it. Final mile logistics, the last bit of the logistical chain, which is probably the most important bit. Where is it? How can you get it? And where is it? We went through that, and one of those boxes there, a box about that size, we opened it up and it was full of morphine, literally crammed full of morphine. You could, more morphine than I've ever seen in my entire life. And people didn't even know it was there. So we had to work with them to actually start to get this audited so that they knew what they've got and knew what it had. And also separate it from other NGOs that were using the same warehouse. There was no security. It was not, it needed improvement. There are also non-medical effects that we had to do. I spoke about surveillance and actually contact tracing, and that was key. I think one of the most challenging ones and one of the most important things was safe burials. Sierra Leone has as with many cultures, it has a culture of you celebrate the death of the individual, you have a funeral, you will share food around the grave, you will share, families will come and you'll effectively celebrate that. The problem with Ebola is as soon as an individual is deceased, if they've got Ebola, they effectively become a superconductor. They become a hotbed for Ebola. It's been even worse. And the actual cause, the root cause, the zero case of Ebola was a nurse that had gone to a funeral, contracted Ebola, and then brought it back to Sierra Leone from there. And that's how it spreads. And so safe burials, but the cultural beliefs is that if you do not do this procedure for your relative or your deceased, you will, it will come back to you. You will get haunted. You will be condemning that deceased to, not a good afterlife. And so we had to have things like anthropologists to actually speak and try and help us understand how do we change this mindset. Because what they were seeing was individuals coming along. That's a traditional burial. They were seeing individuals in white suits and white uniforms coming along, taking their deceased away and never seeing them again. So they were not getting an opportunity to pay their respects. So there had to be a way to establish safe burials. That was done by coming up with an agreement with the tribal chiefs, and the president would sit down with the tribal chiefs and say, this is how you will do it. This is how we're going to do it. There are no exceptions. There are no taking your deceased off into the jungle and doing a burial in secret. You will do it this way. And if you don't, I will take away your tribal staff, which is effectively the sign of authority. And so by getting the president on board, it meant that distilled down to everybody else. And we gradually went to do it. And you'll see, that was Freetown. And the burial, in Freetown, the central sort of main burial site was next to a very big rubbish site. And as quick as they were clearing the rubbish site back, they were then digging. You had one guy clearing the rubbish site, or people died clearing the rubbish site, and then you had somebody else digging the graves alongside. And they were doing their best, but there were rising number of Ebola cases. But probably the most important thing for addressing the Ebola outbreak was safe burials and doing that. So this really summarizes the epidemiology. So we deployed in September. We were doing all of this work, setting up the facilities up until December. We had no idea if we were going to work. And what we were trying to do was a thing called bend the curve. So you can see on that middle dotted line. All we were doing at that stage was building facilities in the hope that it would work and doing the safe burials. You then have those non-medical effects come in, social mobilization, contact tracing, awareness, and things such as our Ebola Training Academy, that helped with the social mobilization. That helped, even though they weren't necessarily getting jobs, there was an awareness. It was distilling myths about what Ebola is and how we catch it. And there were healthcare workers, midwives that were thinking it was evil spirits. So if a healthcare worker is thinking it is that, then the general population would think similar. So it was through the leadership. We then went into a period of lockdown, and then you started to build resilience. So it did, in December, we started to see positive returns for all of that work. But that period from September through to December was a very nervous time, to the point where we also started contingency plans about what do we do if there is unrest and the situation, the law and order breaks down. How do we get ourselves out? How do we get the embassy out? How do we get the dependents out? If we have to just evacuate or move, how do we do that? So we had plans for that as well. So we had to consider that. So it was a degree of uncertainty. If I was going to summarize how we delivered it, flexibility is key. we had to be flexible in our plan. We had to accept additional activity, additional responsibilities. We didn't go there expecting to train a large number of people for Ebola Training Academy. We didn't go there expecting to have to mentor the Sierra Leone army to the extent that we did. We didn't go there having to expect that we would have to run the logistics and do that. So you have to recognise where can you help, more importantly, where you can't help, and leave that alone. Robustness, it was long days. It was an uncertain environment. It was a harsh environment. It was hot. It was sweaty. Air conditioning wasn't really a thing. You just got on with it. Uncertainty, as I said, bending the curve, waiting for the effects that you're doing, hoping that they will have an effect in time. And leadership and interpersonal skills. So my medical commander, he knew Sierra Leone, he knew Sierra Leoneans, he spoke some of their dialect. You go waka waka, which means you go walk walk, we done, that means we finished. So sort of all that, and he could speak to them, and that really broke down barriers. He also had some relationships with the Sierra Leone army from his previous time there, and so he established those, and that gave us a quick head start. The brigade commander, the logistic commander in charge of the whole situation, he was very good at working with people. He was used to working with difficult people, working with easy people, and he really set a tone. And he was very much, if it goes right, it's credit to you. If it goes wrong, I take the responsibility. And I'd known him a long time, and he was a really good man to work for. So he set the tone, and his view was, people will be nervous. People below you will always be nervous. They will always be worried. And people below them will be nervous. You need to remain calm, look like you know what you're doing. And even if you don't know what you're doing, make sure they don't see that, and just work through it and listen to people's views. Other government departments, DFID don't necessarily want to work with the military. The NGOs don't necessarily want to work with the military. Médecins Sans Frontières, don't want to work with the military. A lot of them, but they felt eventually, we all came together and realised that we had to work together. So there were those boundaries to overtake. Army or defence isn't necessarily naturally inclined to working with DFID and others. They're sort of opposed to, not naturally aligned. So we had to work with those. And it was perceptions, and we worked quite closely with them eventually, and they were very helpful. And as I said, willingness to engage in unfamiliar areas. I was never expecting to run almost security patrols to check that people are doing safe burials, but we ended up doing them. So it was an interesting time, and there were some real features that we had to cover on that. If I was going to summarize what we did a rapid deployment of a specific capability. We took a trauma hospital, we turned it into a treating hospital, put it into West Africa, and got it into a stage where it could provide care for healthcare workers. We improved our understanding with other government departments mutually, so we have now a better understanding, which takes it forward. We learned lessons, and some of the lessons, like the Don and Doffin drills, were relevant to how we supported the National Health Service in COVID. Similar things from that. And some of the things that when I was working in Birmingham with the University Hospitals Birmingham, the Queen's Hospital, we did exactly the same thing for them, and they were grateful because it was taking a degree of risk off their personnel, and we taught their personnel how to do it, and we just did the drills. So that worked. We have integration with other troop-contributing nations. Other troop-contributing nations want to support. So we had Canadians come to work with our team. We had the Irish Defence Force come to work as part of headquarters, and we worked with them. We took their strengths and looked at that and worked alongside, and that worked quite well. I'd like to say that we contributed to the prevention of a worldwide pandemic. There was a large Sierra Leone community in the UK, and there was a lot of travel to and fro. And it would only be a matter of time before you had Ebola within the UK, and it may not have had the same devastating effect that it had in Sierra Leone, but it would have an effect. You can see how, the sort of effect that COVID has had, and if you can imagine that was, and more the uncertainty and the risk of it. And we supported a Commonwealth nation. The Sierra Leone, obviously independent, but still a Commonwealth nation, still looked to us for support as the UK, and got that support from it. Were we right? There's a quote: "No military lecture is appropriate unless you've got a quote in there." And so that is the one from the Duke of Wellington. So basically, if we didn't engage and solve and help Sierra Leone sort out the Ebola crisis in its country, it would travel across the world somehow, and we would get it in the UK, and we'd have to deal with that. So that's a pragmatic intervention. A moral obligation, that is my daughter, India, at about the same age. That is She was probably about 10 at the time. That is an 8-year-old girl called Miriam, and Miriam is holding a thing called a survivor certificate, and they used to do a survivor's dance from there. So she'd been ill with COVID, and Ebola, and we would give them some food in the, you see in the middle, it would be a tin of beans, it would be some rice, it would be that, and they would take that home with them, and that would support them. But these Ebola survivor certificates became quite important. They were effectively like a COVID passport. You know, you could get work, you could do that, and there was a degree of immunity on that. So I would suggest, whilst there were a lot of orphans, and we did see quite a lot of orphans, they would get scooped up, and a lot of people died, a lot more would have died if there hadn't been that level of engagement. And so I think it was the morally right thing to do. That concludes my talk. Thank you for listening. I'm more than happy to take any questions if there are any. Thank you.
We almost need a rescue in there. Can I take some question? Paul.
Thank you so much. That was really interesting and captivating. So thank you for the talk, and thank you for what you did in Sierra Leone. I think really, so right about how it might come back to haunt us in a different way.
I'd like to emphasise it wasn't just me. There was a lot of other people.
That was just you.
Yeah. No, there are a few other people.
I want to ask a question about fear.
Yeah.
So maybe in the army it's not talked about openly. I don't. It's a general question about how you deal with fear in the army generally, but I guess dealing with Ebola is quite different to being shot at. And I wondered, how did you personally manage fear within the setup you had there, and was it any different to being in Afghanistan or doing other types of military operations?
For our Zoomers,
Yeah.
a questioner asked about how fear of the infection, fear in that situation was managed in the army.
I meant by the army people.
By the army.
Yeah. So I think you saw the pre-deployment trend that most people were able to go through, and others went through that. I think it's the skills of the preparation. It's understanding what is the risk, understanding how you manage that risk, and following the drills, and accepting that you can do as much of that and you can be as prepared as you like. Something will always go wrong. There is always a risk, and you just got to accept that's the case. Same in Afghanistan, same in Iraq, same in Northern Ireland, same in Bosnia. You know, there is always a risk, whether it be a landmine, whether it be a mortar attack, whether it be somebody deciding they don't like you and they're going to shoot at you. But you cannot dwell on that. You've got a job to do, a job in hand. You just trust that you have been appropriately trained and do that, and think about what you've got to do. So make measured decisions and calculated decisions. Don't take unnecessary risks when you don't have to. And I think generally the mindset of most individuals is if they're doing that and they're so busy and they're concentrating on it, they probably don't always have the time to fear. But you don't go back to your bed space at night and worry about getting Ebola the following day or getting shot at. Otherwise, you just wouldn't get any sleep. So you just have to get on with it. But I think the side of that though is people do have to deal with the anxiety and the stress that they've been under, and you have adjustment periods. So what I didn't talk about there was the decompression. And one of the things we learned from Iraq and we learned from Afghanistan is that if you take an individual from a stressful combat situation or stressful operational situation where they're used to one set of rules and doing that, put them on a plane, send them home at the end of their tour and say, thank you very much, go off and have some leave, go down the pub, you then have problems. So what we introduced is that from Afghanistan is a thing called decompression. So the planes from Afghanistan will stop in Cyprus for about 2 or 3 days. Individual get some briefings, they get said, you may find difficulty in adjusting. If those conditions last after 8 weeks, then you need to start thinking to talk to your doctor and that. But generally expect normal for that. And do that. And they let off a bit of steam. They go down to the beach and they do some various activities. So you try and just stage that down. So we introduced the same thing for Sierra Leone, but they did it in Brize Norton. And so people would come back and they would have to go through this period of briefing, and it was a bit shorter, but for that, just to try and help them manage that separation. But there is stress. People deal with it in different ways. People get scared. People worry about it, and depends what you're doing. But sometimes you just got to get on with it. Really. So that was good.
Yeah, right.
Front and then back.
Okay. I just have a question. It's a very small detail. You were talking about the PPE and the protection of the personnel, and I was just intrigued by what you did with the ambulance drivers and the helicopter pilots. If they were potentially transporting an infected individual, were they shuttered off, or did they have to wear PPE, or how?
So no, they wore PPE. The helicopter pilots, they were separated off.
Yeah, I'm just imagining how that could.
But we did, well, what we had for the helicopters is we used like a prototype, almost like a, I hate to call it a glass coffin, but from there. We didn't necessarily move Ebola patients by air from there. That would be, the helicopters we used for somebody who had a road accident and wasn't necessarily exhibiting those signs. But we did have our separate procedures. We had contingency plans for an individual who's exhibiting signs of Ebola and needs to be strategically evacuated. Originally, the government was telling us if somebody has Ebola, if a British service personnel has Ebola or catches something like that, they're not coming back, they're staying there. The first person that got Ebola, or Puli, that all changed, and we started then, and they came back to the Royal Free. So we then set up a contingency plan very quickly on how do we physically move that individual? How do we pass that individual from one stage to the next without those individuals contracting there? And we had a thing called an isolator. The Royal Air Force had air transport isolator, ATI, and that was effectively like a tented facility, and you could put the patient in that facility. It fit inside a plane, inside the cargo of a plane, and then you put the patient in there, and you could treat the patient, through that and from there. So they would fly back with one of those, and we would move them to that point.
But what about a situation where you might have somebody injured in a traffic accident, and let's say they were incubating the disease? So, like, all potential casualties could be an infection, or I just want to.
So we had to, again, this is where you have to take it. We had to take a degree of risk. You would, for example, take temperatures and do the temperature checks and see whether or not they were. Everywhere we went, when you went into a base or left a base, you would have somebody with that infrared temperature, and they would take your temperature and they would record it. When you signed out, you were signing out who you were, where you were going, what your temperature was, and they would, and when you signed back in, and if your temperature came above, I think it was something like 39 degrees, you would then, get taken off to one side and kept under a degree of scrutiny. Things that you also had to be careful of, so is your own hygiene. Hand washing was a big thing. Sierra Leone during the middle of Ebola is not a place where you want to have diarrhea and vomiting, because the symptoms are similar, and so you don't want to suddenly have that. So we had to be very careful about that, and we had people that would check that people were washing their hands. People, doing audits of people going into a cookhouse and say, right, 1 out of 100 hasn't washed his hands. You're in trouble. So you have to, part of it about also protection, but you have to do things like that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Question at the back.
Thank you very much. But could you tell us a little more about the treatment that was carried out and how successful it was? What sort of survival?
I can tell you what I know, but I would caveat it from the very outset. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a clinician. My job was to get the right people that knew what the treatment was in the right place. From recollection, the Ebola treatment facility, the facility we put up and ran, had a better survival rate than other facilities. So I think our mortality rate was something like 40%, whereas other facilities were about 60%. And they were more basic. They provided quite a lot of analgesics, a lot of fluid therapy, and a lot of that, and a lot of support in that respect. That's probably as much as I should say, because otherwise I'll start to, get into areas where I don't understand the reality. But it was a basic level of treatment. There wasn't any cause. We would have contact tracing. We would have PCR testing, and so stuff like that. And we would do some testing. But the treatment, I think, was very much more focused on maintaining the fluids, pain relief, in that respect. So that probably doesn't answer your question, really.
Comment and a question, but on the legacy, perhaps, of what we did, I was flying back from Freetown, Sierra Leone, in February 2020, and we arrived at the airport and were greeted by people who took our temperatures and then directed us to large tubs of soapy water to wash our hands because of COVID. When we arrived at Heathrow, there was nothing. So they were aware, and they'd obviously learned the lessons, of the prevention and early.
Yeah, I think they did. I mean, as a country, they may be resource poor, but they're not naive. They're certainly not stupid. And they are probably more efficient with their limited resources than we may be, and more proactive. So, you know, I have a lot of respect for them. Particularly the Sierra Leone. There was a lot of political infighting, which you don't normally see, but that probably happens in the UK. But yeah, they did listen and took on board lessons.
I'm just intrigued what you said about an audit of hand washing and wondered how you could tell who hadn't washed their hands.
Because you would have people, so at mealtime, people will be fed centrally. And we did things like made sure the chefs were Sierra Leone chefs. And I think one day we saw a chef, as I was coming to the chef was outside the cookhouse with a stick trying to kill a rat. And then he went back into serving food. And so we worked a bit on them just to make sure their health sanitation procedures are up to scratch. But we would have people that would just stand near the entranceway to the cookhouse, and they would watch and they would take a note. And if somebody wasn't washing their hands, they would record it, and then they would go to their boss and say, "Your individual didn't wash their hands. What are you going to do about it?"
Nothing more technical.
And you know, and we have people on. You know, it's an easy way to get yourself on the guard roster if you don't wash your hands. It was literally just watching.
So David, then
how many cases?
That's a very good question. I think it was, from my understanding, I think it was just short of 100. It wasn't the volumes, because it was more of it was a 20-bed facility, it was a smaller facility. And whilst it was originally intended for the foreign healthcare workers, to bring them back into the country, we did also begin to treat other, Sierra Leone healthcare workers and other individuals. But it wasn't the hundreds that you would expect, but there were those in the other treatment facilities.
there and then.
Just also the comment, thank you very much for the talk, but I've had the privilege to work in both South Africa and Angola, rural South Africa.
Yeah.
And in South Africa, it was just the beginning of the HIV epidemic. So it was a really important time to engage with the local community, particularly with the traditional healers, not only to look at practices that maybe were unsafe then, but also to bring them into our health facilities, show them about TB, what TB, how important it was for people to continue with their TB treatment at home, that kind of thing. So it was, you did mention engaging with local.
Yeah, and this is why I would, if you'd ask me, you're going to go on operational deployment and we're going to send some anthropologists with you. Like, I don't even know what an anthropologist does. I do now, but it was very much about changing the cultures, changing the understanding, and trying to work away with them, with the engagement. So you found some common ground that achieved a safe effect. But yeah, you're absolutely right. And those non-medical effects were probably more important than the medical effects. You can treat people if they've got Ebola, but if you don't stop them getting Ebola, then you'll soon be limited. You're just repeating the same problems.
Paul talked a bit about fear for you not working out in Sierra Leone with the Ebola. And I was just thinking, you went somewhere and were told you're flying out on Sunday, you might be 2 days, you might be 6 months. And you left a wife and kids at home.
Yeah.
Was that worse than going to Afghanistan?
You'd have to ask her.
I think families are left at home. The spouse goes off into what sort of environment. We've got a chap in our village who was in the infantry, went to Afghanistan, came back injured. He made a good recovery. Must be awful stressful.
It was, but I think things like we have communication for this. So previously, when the kids were really little, Tim went to Iraq, wasn't it?
Yeah, and no, Afghanistan.
Afghanistan,
like-
and then we'd have no.
Iraq, yeah, Iraq.
We couldn't speak, could we?
No.
You know, we had no contact until, it was once every 2 weeks.
Yeah.
So I had no way of knowing if you were okay, whereas this was, yeah, there was a risk, but you can't, I think I was used to it, because Tim would always be deployed in some sort of risky situation, and this was different, but yeah, it's a bit like that, you just have to get on with it, don't you?
I think she appreciates the peace and quiet as well.
Yeah. Tea
But yeah, I mean, it's a challenge for the family. It's all very well for us going off. We've got a unified task. We've got something to get on with and do what we've got to do. But yes, families back in the UK or wherever, whether it be Sierra Leone, whether it be other operative deployments, they have to deal with that. And the thing you'll find is you have basically a comms blackout, communications blackout, if somebody's injured. So and this was in Afghanistan, but the same things applied. So if somebody was injured in a roadside bomb, then all the phone networks would be down. And you would have, that would, but it would still get reported on the news. And then families would have to wait until, if the comms came back up, then they knew it wasn't their individual, their partner or their relative or their dependent that had been hurt, because they would only put them back up by the time they got in touch with the next of kin and say, it was to stop people ringing up and say, look, so-and-so's wife, tell so-and-so's wife that something's happened. So yeah, there is uncertainty, but the difference, I think probably the difference with Sierra Leone, it happened quite quickly, whereas sometimes Afghanistan, Iraq happened quite quickly actually, but Afghanistan, we got a bit of notice. I got pre-deployment training and it was more of a programmed thing. So it's different, but yeah. But I think Sarah managed pretty well. She's still married to me. Just about. And the kids, they're pretty immune to it.
If I could ask Prof. Barry Wright to come and give us our vote of thanks.
Well, thank you very much for that very powerful talk. Your account of the Ebola outbreak shows the organisation, the coordination, the courage, the high quality care that's needed, and what's impressive is the complexity of the work you describe, with a great need to pay attention to the logistics, the training, the multiple challenges, the local culture and beliefs, all brought sharply into focus by your talk. One or two things stand out for me. It's always impressive when at the beginning your bosses trust you so much that they ask you to tell them what you want them to tell you. The NHS work like that. Easier. And also the donning and doffing drills, the impressive importance of hygiene, which we all know so much about. And also to look after the carers. I noticed that was on one of your first slides about the medical support to deployed teams, because if you don't look after the carers, you can't have a service, and we need to, that's instructive for us today as well, I think. It was interesting the way you talked about how we manage fear, because you used a few terms there. Just get on with it was one of them, which I think we probably tend to do ourselves at personal cost sometimes. Keeping busy, you also said, you manage to feel by keeping busy, and it's interesting that the NHS is using a lot of therapies that are really keeping busy, activity scheduling, behavioural activation now coming into force for depression, for example. Keeping active and busy is actually quite a good way of staying mentally healthy. Debriefing and adjustment, and you talked about some quite interesting things there. Would have loved to have heard more about some of those things. So yes, you've described an exemplar of prevention, really, because you mentioned £100,000 on flip charts and things like that. But I guess what you're really talking about is we're spending to save, aren't we? We're spending a lot of money in prevention to save a pandemic, which is going to cause cost a hell of a lot more money. So it's something that the previous government, perhaps, prevention lost sight of, perhaps, and hopefully is coming back into focus now. We hope. So thank you very much for sharing your experiences with such clarity and humility. So please join me once more in thanking Colonel Tim Steele for the excellent talk this evening.